Good evening, everyone. This is a very special occasion for the Royal Asiatic Society because we are here primarily to honour Tony Stockwell, who is sitting, waiting to discover just how embarrassed he is going to be by the things I and others are about to say. The reason that we're honouring Tony is because those of us who currently enjoy the offerings of the Royal Asiatic Society may not realise fully the extent to which, from the 1990s, there was what I could call a Robinson-Stockwell-Otter revolution in the affairs of the Society. And Tony was very critical in that transformation because during the time that he was president on the first time round and on the second time round, he was president while a lot of things were happening, like moving into this building, like absolutely revolutionizing the constitution of the Society and establishing a directorship of a different sort from the one that had existed. And of course, he did it with enormous tact, and he did it with enormous attention to detail. Because, of course, Tony, for his wonderful academic work, drew very heavily on British government sources. And I hope he won't take it amiss if I say he has a very fine Mandarin mind, and that the exercise of that intelligence was really absolutely crucial, I think, in enabling the Society to move through the late 1990s and into the 2010s, an utterly transformed organization. So the Society is very indebted to Tony and has decided that you should receive its Bicentenary Medal, which is a very nice thing to have. And also, when Tony was deciding it was really time that he should not be so actively involved in the Society, he was lent on to do a third term as president. And he said, no, I won't do it. I'll only do it for 2 years. And when we got to the end of the 2 years, we had no one in mind to step into his shoes. So he was obliged to continue for the full term. And the director, Dr. Otter, had a plan that he would have a lunch and he would be given a present at lunch. And somehow, when he came to the end of this term, and somehow the lunch didn't happen and the present wasn't given. And other arrangements were tried and it just didn't happen. So we've waited nearly a decade, I guess now. So we have a present which would have been given to Tony at lunchtime on his retirement from the third run as presidency. And we have a medal to salute him and to honor him for fantastic service to the Society. And other people in a moment will, I'm sure, say more about Tony as a historian. But Tony, if you could bear it, if you would like to come and receive your medal and your present, we would be very pleased. Well, that's what. Then we'll have to thank you for you there. So we decided that the cherry on the cake this evening would be that there would be a lecture, the Tony Stockwell honorary lecture, but to Tony's relief, he would not be giving. But we decided that we would find one of his most devoted students and then research students. And so it's a very great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Nick White, who is the Professor of Imperial and Commonwealth History at John Moores University in Liverpool, and also directs the most amazing project on Liverpool as a maritime city and controlling great trading networks. And Tony was Nick's supervisor for his PhD, and he did work on Malaysia and Singapore, and Nick is perhaps about that, I don't know, tonight.
Thank you. I'm deeply gratified to have been invited to deliver this lecture in honour of Tony Stockwell, who's had a hugely beneficial influence on my historical research and my academic career. This evening's lecture, as Gordon in a way has anticipated, will merge my twin professional passions in the history of decolonisation, especially in Malaysia and Singapore, and in maritime history, particularly of the port of Liverpool, which into the 1970s remained a major UK entrepot for both Malaysian latex rubber and palm oil. Now, during December 1968, two new ocean-going international shipping lines were incorporated. The Malaysian International Shipping Corporation, known as MISC, and Singapore's Neptune Orient Lines, known as NOL. As Tim Bunnell demonstrates, the arrival of MISC's bunga boats, named after Malaysian flowers, in Liverpool from December 1971, was more important in the nationalist awakening of Malay seafarers on Merseyside than independence for Malaya in 1957. Or the creation of Malaysia 6 years later. A Singaporean master mariner, meanwhile, recalled that many a Singapore seafarer wished to work for NOL, the national line, not because of the money, but for the pride they felt about having a national line. By the early 21st century, NOL was among the top 10 liner shipping groups in the world. And as a subsidiary of state oil and gas conglomerate, Petronas, MISC controlled one of the largest tanker fleets in the world. In the 1960s, such trajectories were not anticipated by the British shipowners who continued to dominate the Far East Freight Conference, and to which MISC and NOL were admitted in 1969. Eric Koo, NOL's first executive director, described the almighty Far East Conference, the mother of shipping conferences then, led mainly by the British lines who ruled the international shipping trade and that dictated which carriers could carry how much cargo at what price and to which ports. From the early 1960s, the Ben line of Edinburgh, the Glen line of London, and above all, Liverpool's Blue Funnel line, which also owned Glen line, conveniently, expected business would carry on largely as usual. There might be the inconvenience of a quick repaint of ship's livery, but in the short term at least, the ships would continue to be owned and run by the UK lines and on terms favourable to them. Essentially, these would be British ships flying the Malaysian flag. In April 1962, with the creation of Malaysia through the merger of Malaya with Singapore, North Borneo, Sabah, Sarawak and Brunei looking likely, British shipowners learned of plans by Sweden's Wallenius line to establish a Greater Malaysia shipping company. Two British shipowners were immediately dispatched to Kuala Lumpur to persuade the federal government that UK conference members establish and sponsor an alternative Malayan line. At end July 1964, Blue funnel intelligence was that the project would be accepted by the Malaysian government without undue bargaining and with attractive tax breaks. In March 1966, Eric Wingate, the boss of Mansfield's, Blue Funnel's wholly owned shipping agents in Singapore, reported that a paper being completed by the top bureaucrat in Malaysia's Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Raja Mohar, concludes in favour of the British shipowners' plan. By June 1968, Malaysia's Finance Minister, Tan Siew Sin, as chairman of the Cabinet Committee on a National Shipping Line, was considering Mohar's report. Australia's High Commission in Kuala Lumpur reported to Canberra that a British firm remained confident that its sponsorship will be accepted. Instead, however, the British lines ended up with their nightmare scenario, envisaged at Singapore's exit from Malaysia in August 1965, of 2 lines extra instead. Moreover, the new national lines after 1968 were fully owned and managed by Malaysian and Singaporean interests. UK shipping barons had hoped for a more managed economic decolonisation, and here my research interlocks with Tony Stockwell's in considering how the control and ownership of decolonisation was lost. The twists and turns of local and regional politics influenced maritime decolonisation in Commonwealth Southeast Asia as much as, if not more than, imperial and international dimension. As Prof Tony, as he would be known in Malaysia, as Prof Tony told us in his British documents on the end of empire, Malaya, volumes published in 1995, the documents show that the British did not have it all their own way in the run-up to independence. Not only did the crisis over the Malayan Union during 1946 and the outbreak of the communist insurrection in 1948 knock them off course, but also the alliance of non-communist communal political parties moved them further and faster than they would otherwise have gone after 1954. And in his BD Malaysia, 2004, meantime, Tony pointed out that British ministers and officials frequently felt that they were being taken for a ride by Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, the Tunku, the Prime Minister of Malaya, or the Sultan of Brunei. Malaysia was hardly an artificial creation of British neo-colonialism. As Tony told us in 2005, Britain's declining power constrained its capacity to influence developments, let alone to integrate the components into a nation state. Indeed, in line with the Stockwell method, cautious interrogation of British archives, commercial rather than official in this case, reveals much about the local dimension to decolonisation, where local archives are sadly absent. Much of this lecture is based upon the Primrose file in the marvellous Blue Funnel or Ocean Group archive at Liverpool's Maritime Museum. Now, I have to confess, I failed to appreciate the significance of the Primrose file in previous research. I overlooked it, believing the file was likely something to do with Disraeli and the Primrose League. A somewhat stupid assumption, because the Holt family members that controlled Blue Funnel into the 1960s were dynasty-long supporters of the Liberal Party and absolutely not the Tories. As demanded by the Far East Conference in April 1962, secrecy was paramount and nothing should be allowed to leak of the present discussions and intention. Hence, the Blue Funnel file's origin lay in the moniker given to the plans and preparations for maritime decolonisation, codenamed Operation Primrose. Interestingly, Sir John Nicholson, Blue Funnel's senior partner, in other words, chairman, in the 1960s, had advised Lord Louis Mountbatten on Operation Zipper, Operation Zipper for the reoccupation of Malaya during World War II. The Primrose file and other UK archives, triangulated with the memoirs of key players, provide a much more complex and convoluted analysis of the origins of the national shipping lines than the official story contained in, for example, Noel's corporate history, Beyond Boundaries, which was published in 2004. So first off, let's delve deeper into the plans of the British shipping fraternity, which were not entirely conservative or reactionary. Admittedly, as expat shipping managers in Singapore reflected in September 1965, Primrose was, quote, designed as a defensive measure to protect the conference against the threat of a national line fostered by non-conference interests. Sir Herbert McDavid and Sir Douglas Thompson, at the helms of Glen and Ben lines respectively, believed in April 1962 that local government support for Primrose would ensure Kuala Lumpur doing its utmost to discourage other local applicants for conference membership in the trade to and from Europe. But while the startup would require 100% UK ownership and management, the quid pro quo was a generous package to permit eventual local control and direction. Developing a truly Malayan company compared to the alleged national facade in the Swedish scheme, Primrose's British for an influential local board of directors, transfer vessels to the Malayan registry to bear Malay names and fly the Federation flag, train Malayan staff ashore and afloat, and transfer some years hence shares up to 60% to local citizens, in which federal government participation would be most welcome. Moreover, sensitive to intercommunal sensibilities, special provision would be made for employment of and share ownership by ethnic Malays. 3 Malay directors, including the chairman, moreover, were proposed alongside 2 expats, 1 federal citizen of Chinese heritage and 1 Singaporean, the latter demonstrating an awareness of Greater Malaysia probabilities. Mirroring the language of official decolonisation, the British ship owners hoped Malaysia's national line should grow up in an atmosphere of goodwill. Named Syarikat Bintang Timur, Eastern Star Company, the national line would become wholly Malayan, or maybe eventually Malaysian-owned, controlled and managed. Now, akin to British official planning for the Malayan Union during World War II, British ship owners offered a new deal. To adapt Tony's phrase, if he'll allow me, from his 1979 monograph, recolonisation was intended as a prelude to effective decolonisation. Furthermore, as Tony argued for decolonisation generally in his 1999 professorial lecture at Royal Holloway, UK policymakers expected to retain influence through managed transfers of power. Yet what they ultimately got was rarely the successor state they wanted or expected. Invoking the spirit of Sir Stamford Raffles in October 1970, Britain's High Commissioner in Singapore, Sir Arthur de la Mare, declared that our entrepreneurs, our investors, and our businessmen must now lead for Britain, as cited in Tony's 2009 Across the Causeway essay. An obstacle in preserving British influence, however, was precisely those entrepreneurs, business people, investors, the commercial leaders themselves, who in shipping did not constitute a united front. There was an undercurrent of rivalry within the conference, mirroring inter-Whitehall tensions that Stockwell argued bedeviled Britain's retreat from Southeast Asia and beyond. Now, shipping conferences were designed to minimise competition. That's what they're all about. But that didn't mean that the Far East lines enjoyed each other's company. In 1950, Blue Funnel's senior partner, Sir John Hobhouse, lambasted Ben Line's post-war new building programme, which, if emulated, would, quote, land us in a position in which none of us would be able to operate the class of ship which is a credit to the nation and of inestimable value, in war. And in the spirit of Liverpool exceptionalism, Blue Funnel, somewhat sneakily, put up their own scheme alongside Primrose, whereby its CRIS Malayan registered subsidiary in the coastal trade would be expanded into deep sea activity. There was meantime a long-running Liverpool disdain for London, and Blue Funnel resented P&O's featherbedding through mail subsidies and the London Line's virtual monopoly of passages for official and military personnel. India Buildings, Blue Funnel's headquarters in Liverpool, was named in celebration of the breaking of the East India Company monopolies. I should say, actually, this is the second India Buildings, which is still in Liverpool today, photographed sometime in the 1960s. This is put up in the 1920s and 1930s. The original building dates, the first building was from 1834 and was named, you know, in defiance, if you like, of London and celebration of the fact that the East India Company had been beaten. And it's interesting that P&O was not included in the Primrose project. Conference chair and P&O executive Michael Thwaites reminded Sir John Nicholson in January 1964 that I have never, of course, liked the Primrose project. So internecine struggles and differences of opinion weakened the imperial camp. More importantly, nevertheless, the plans of the shipping grandees fell afoul of the realities of local and regional circumstance. A series of uncharted. Of course, there was confrontation with Indonesia by 1963, in which President Sukarno opposed the formation of Malaysia on the grounds that it was designed to secure rubber, tin and oil supplies for the imperialists. Konfrontasi both delayed decision-making in Kuala Lumpur and, to avoid charges of neo-colonialism, induced a search for a less UK-dominated shipping scheme. In November 1963, Blue Funnel manager Eric Price was surprised how important it genuinely seems in KL's eyes, Kuala Lumpur's eyes, that Indonesia shall not be allowed to sneer, quote, another neo-colonialist facade. Given the Indonesian situation, Sir John Nicholson in Liverpool opined it desirable to play down identity of promoters. Already in October 1963, Malayan Treasury officials were querying Malaysian Treasury officials were querying Primrose's financial mechanics, especially its capital construction and projected earnings. Prime Minister Tun Abdul Razak certainly struck a defiant, almost third worldist tone at the inauguration of MISC's services in December 1970. As a producer of raw commodities, which are essentially meant for overseas markets, we should no longer accept a situation where we are always at the mercy of outside forces. Nicholson appreciated back in January 1964 that the Federation government might decide against pushing Primrose while the economic consequences of confrontation are, quote, hanging over their heads. This points to a second obstacle in Primrose's path: public finance. Even before the Konfrontasi defence bill landed in his lap, Finance Minister Tan Siew Sin was known to be against a national line. In November 1963, Minister of Commerce and Industry Lim Swee On reckoned it essential to have government financial participation, but doubted the finance minister would be particularly enthusiastic. Primrose got caught in the Kuala Lumpur bureaucratic web. Rubber trader Gantek Yao shared with Mansfields in October 1964 that Commerce and Industry Minister Lim, Transport Minister Sardon Jabir, and the officials making recommendations to Cabinet all seemed to have different ideas. And in this, public finances prevailed. Tunku confessed to a British ship owner in November 1965 that there was no cash because of defence commitment. The budget would show a deficit of 300 million Malayan dollars. At that juncture, of course, Singapore had separated from Malaysia, adding a third twist to the national shipping saga. Singapore's time inside Malaysia from September 1963 complicated matters anyway. In March 1964, the UK Ministry of Transport representative in Singapore, Peter Gardner, reported sitting on a powder barrel here at the moment, given very real tension which exists in shipping matters between the Singapore and federal government. Shipping was technically a concurrent matter, ultimately controlled by Kuala Lumpur, which regarded the national line as a matter involving considerable prestige, whereas Singapore, as Gardner reported, take the view that they are the only people who know anything at all about shipping and ports and must be left to run matters themselves. By November 1964, a Chinese shipping group in Singapore had proposed an alternative to Primrose, arguing for a line with more of a national character. At end 1964, the national line, as Blue Funnel's agents recognised, was added to the list of subjects on which the central government and the government of Singapore are voicing opposing views. So the UK ship owners got caught in the middle of the competing nationalisms that would bring Greater Malaysia down. As Porter and Stockwell shrewdly observed in 1989, it was not nationalism, but competing nationalisms that both strained and often led to the abandonment of British plans for orderly transfer of power. And with Singapore's exit in August 1965, the imponderables multiplied. At the end of empire, imperial shipping's eminence grise in London, Liverpool and Edinburgh, and their expat agents on the spot grasped at straws, just as Tony identified that British officialdom was flummoxed. Amongst various imagined permutations, expansion of China trades, deflecting Singapore ship owners from the Far East Europe route, and a Malaysian Airways-style joint carrier agreement whereby just one new shipping line could be contained within the conference. Yet the Indonesian trade proved disappointing, and in the 1960s, Knowles Eric Koo recalled that the Far East Europe trade was the shipping route which local ship owners coveted. Moreover, in September 1965, Raja Mohar rejected the Malaysia-Singapore Airlines solution as inapplicable to shipping and dismissed the trade rapprochement imagined by Sir Herbert McDavid as just not on. And it should be added here that the shared airline, of course, proved only a very temporary fix, with Malaysia and Singapore going their separate ways from 1972. A fourth barrier to Primrose concerned macroeconomic considerations, freight rates and foreign exchange, particularly that accompanied decolonisation. Throughout Asia, and particularly in government circles, shipping conferences were regarded as price rings, used to maintain artificially high rates and bleed the underdeveloped countries in a form of economic colonialism, reported the UK's shipping attaché in Singapore in 1961. Influential Malaysian business interests agreed. Senator Gan Tek Yao, in conversation with a Blue Funnel manager, dubbed the Far East Conference old colonialists and claimed that charters were 1/4 the cost of conference liners and present arrangements just can't last. By 1968, Gan, as head of Malaysia's rubber exchange, was leading a campaign against high freight rates, increased for shippers, it was claimed, through the conference's surcharge as compensation for the devaluation of sterling in November 1967. Gan pronounced that the Far East Conference has taken Malaysia and Singapore for granted, thinking they are too powerful. Across the causeway, Eric Koo, joining the Singapore Administrative Service in the early 1960s and being confronted with files and files of shipping complaints by shippers, by their associations and the local chambers of commerce, the only way to help them was to go into business and provide an alternative, said Koo. In Kuala Lumpur, Minister of Commerce Lim told expat commercials in March 1966 that Malaysia was losing about £300 million per annum in foreign exchange and believed, therefore, that his country must have its own shipping line. In his 1991 master's thesis, Malaysian Ministry of Transport employee Abdullah Yusuf Basiran argued that the creation of MISC and other Malaysian shipping lines later was the major step taken by the government in order to reduce the outflow of invisible. In Singapore too, Noel Planner and later managing director Goh Chok Tong expounded in 1969 that, quote, when it is realised that the freight element is about 10% of the value of the goods, It requires no imagination to expect that huge sums of money can be earned from the country's import and export trade. If further remembered that most of these freight charges are paid in foreign exchange to foreign carriers, it becomes all the more clear why the government wishes to set up a national shipping line. The purchase of Southeast Asian countries within the global economy was supposed to be enhanced by regional forums facilitating economic integration. The Association of Southeast Asia after 1961 and the wider Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, from 1967. In practice, however, intra-regional competition rather than cooperation encouraged unilateral action. In 1962, Valenius also applied for conference rights in the name of Thai Lines Limited. And by October of that year, Mansfields were aware that the Philippines wished to own ships and with these ships carry the produce of Malaya. This proposal is not at all attractive to Malaya. A Philippines national line also would spark off reactions in both Malaysia and Singapore, but principally the latter noted Blue Funnel's agents post-split in September 1965. Quizzed by Peter Gardner in March 1966 on whether Malaysia might consider an association with some other country or group of countries, Raja Azam, Secretary General of the Ministry of Transport, confessed that Malaysia wanted a national fleet of their own. Given Lee Kuan Yew's various regional manoeuvrings, the Malaysians were anxious, in Gardner's view, to make sure that if there is to be any suggestion of a joint line, then their bargaining position will be strengthened by having a line of their own in existence. In Kuala Lumpur, then, all was falling into place for the perfect package, formulated by Malaysian commodity trader and import substitution industrialist Robert Kwok Hock Nguyen. And there's Robert Kwok with Suharto round about this time, emphasising his amazing connections throughout the Southeast Asia region. And Kwok would combine with Hong Kong shipping owner. Sorry, there should be a warning here. A trigger warning. There will be smoking in some of the images. Frank Sao, the Hong Kong shipping owner, Frank Sao Wen King. Propelled by a desire to avoid Malaysia being, in Kwok's words, tied to the apron strings of the ex-colonial government of Britain through Blue Funnel, on one hectic day in 1968, Kwok and Sao dashed around Kuala Lumpur to persuade the top ministers of the virtues of their plan. As Kwok reminisced, within 2 to 3 weeks, we were picked at a cabinet meeting to start the national shipping line. We were like a dark horse coming from behind in the last furlong and pipping the favourite at the post. The Kwok Sao prospectus involved Malaysian majority ownership from the outset, faster, brand new Japanese-built ships compared to the extant British tonnage, which was characterised as 3 old tubs by the Singaporeans in their previous critiques of Primrose, and in further pan-Asian mode, financing of the new vessels via Japanese blood debt reparation payments for Pacific War atrocities. The Japanese ships would form the nucleus of an embryonic fleet of 6 modern Penang-registered cargo liners designed and purpose-built for the Far East Europe trade. The additional 4 10,000-ton vessels were constructed in Japan as well, and to the same specification as the 2 gifted by Tokyo. Leveraging on their established Northeast Asian business networks, both Kwok's memoirs and Sao's recollections confirm the duo received firm encouragement in their maritime enterprise from Malaysian officials and ministers, including Finance Minister Tan Siew Sin and Deputy Premier Tun Razak. British management was assumed from the get-go. As well as Kwok and Sao, MISC's board was constituted in 1968 by Dr. Ismail, Kwok's closest friend in the Malay nationalist elite, and Malaya's first Minister of Commerce and Industry, and G.K. Rama Iyer, Under-Secretary Special Duties in the Prime Minister's Department. Leslie Yu Peng Meng, formerly Ben Line's manager in Bangkok, was appointed Managing Director. Equally Anglo-sceptic, the Singapore National Line, Noel, turned for expertise to Pakistan. After writing a project paper in April 1968 on establishing a Singapore national carrier for trading around the world and round the clock, Master Mariner and Pakistan National Shipping Corporation manager M.J. Saeed served as Noel's managing director from 1969 to 1973. Original thinking was to purchase tonnage for the coastal trade, but like Misk, Saeed recounted that the main priority soon became to enter the major international trade lane. Noel also wanted to acquire tonnage to charter out to third parties and engaged in a new building strategy. Malaysian style again, taking British hand-me-downs was unacceptable. Noel purchased two German Hansa-Line heavy lift ships, renamed Neptune Topaz and Neptune Zircon. The four new builds, meanwhile, were split between Japan and, in support of import substitution, Singapore's Jurong shipyard. In intra-Asian mode, the new vessels were chartered to China's Sinotran. Delivered in 1973, two semi-container ships were built in Finland. Upending semi-colonial lines, the final setup of Misk and Noel echoed local political economies. Noel's capital was 100% government-owned, transferred from the Ministry of Finance to Temasek Holdings, Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, during 1969. Whereas Misk was an interesting public-private partnership with a mix of ethnic Chinese and Malay interests. Misk accommodated Malaysian Chinese interests, including an equity share for the Chinese Chambers of Commerce and the Malaysian Chinese Association, the main Chinese political party. But as a progenitor of the new economic policy in the 1970s, as Bunnell observed, the National Line simultaneously appeased a burgeoning radical Malay ethno-nationalism. Tunku told UK shipowners in November 1965 that, quote, the Malays were not businessmen and would only make a hash of maritime enterprise, likely explaining why Kwok and Sao were founding directors of Misk. Nevertheless, Transport Minister Sardon was believed to be looking for personal support from a class of younger Malays wanting things for national prestige. And Nicholson referred to an incipient faction of young Turks who might force the foundation of a Malaysian line not to Blue Funnel's liking. Indeed, Musa Hitam, a young Turk Malay, later Deputy Prime Minister to Mahathir Mohamad, was appointed Sardon's political secretary in July 1964. Misk's foundation imagery conjured up a resurrection of the early modern Malay sea power of Malacca, and the line's crews were mostly ethnic Malays. On top of 1/6 of Misk's initial issued capital held by the federal government in trust, Malay interests were represented by a shareholding for the Muslim pilgrimage fund Tabung Haji and the rural development body MARA. And according to Blue Funnel Intel in April 1972, the public stake was upped to reach 60%, whereas Robert Kwok reckoned that Kwok Brothers, Sao, and the MCA Group, the Malayan Chinese Association Group, together had originally held easily over 50% of Misk's equity. Kwok would become increasingly alienated by Malay chauvinism, but even so didn't divest from Misk entirely until 1987. Hence, Misk, you could say, represented a classic Malaysianization of personnel, management and capital through Sino-Malay private-public, political-commercial combinations and with intra-Asian look-east leanings beneficial to overseas Chinese interests. With the British shipping lines excluded as well, Misk was indeed the beautiful solution. And in this, Primrose, the British lines, backed the wrong Malay horse in targeting veteran conservative nationalist Nick Ahmed Kamil, who features in Tony's 1979 monograph on the Malayan Union as likely chair, precisely the type of aristocratic dignitary that Mahathir Mohamad castigated later in his Malay dilemma as window dressing, token directors, rather than representing genuine Malay participation in commerce and industry. I would love to have got a Mahathir link to the origins of MISC, but I can't find it, unfortunately. But we have Musa Hitam, at least. Reflecting strained business-government relations in Singapore and lingering socialism in the ruling People's Action Party, NOL was a state-owned enterprise from inception. The Singapore line's top echelon was dominated by the politico-bureaucratic complex. Eric Koo and Goh Chok Tong arrived from the Economic Development Board and the Economic Section of the Ministry of Finance, respectively, while NOL's first chair, Hon Sui Sen, doubled up as boss of the Economic Development Board before becoming Minister of Finance. Goh Chok Tong, of course, I'm sure you know, would become Singapore's second Prime Minister in 1990. And MJ Said dubbed Finance Minister Goh Keng Swee, who had objected to Primrose, the founding father of NOL. As such, NOL's losses in its early years were tolerated by Lee Kuan Yew's regime. It was just a matter of the money going from one pocket to the other, as Goh Chok Tong admitted. In contrast, MISC, according to Robert Kwok, quickly flourished, thanks largely to Frank Sau's commercial shipping know-how and the choice of experienced managers. Although the Singapore ship owners were excluded, Singapore businesses, notably Lee Rubber, closely associated with the Overseas Chinese Banking Corporation, OCBC. Both Lee Rubber and OCBC were suspected by the British ship owners of having backed the opposition to Primrose between 1964 and 1965. Singapore's commodity traders were disgruntled that NOL joined the Far East Conference. After all, the National Line was established to address the complaints of shippers against the unfair practices of the freight conferences. But both Singaporean and Malaysian lines played a Trojan horse, reform from within role at the cartel. The UK-dominated Rubber Growers Association recognised in November 1976 the determination by all parties in Malaysia to break the monopoly position of the British-dominated conference. Allocated cargoes were frustratingly far below the 40% recommended by UNCTAD, the United Nations Commission on Trade and Development, for national carriers. Nevertheless, blue funnel sailings eastward were reduced from 8 to 7 sailings per month in 1971, given MISC and NOL competition. By March 1972, Straits carryings were likewise reduced, given that Blue Funnel was offered its lowest ever total of only 16 loaders. MISC exploited the Sabah trade with bulkwood carriers to Japan, and through a 40% in container national, was reserved a slice of the burgeoning sea-land intermodal box business. Affecting Blue Funnel's long-established feeder services, cabotage legislation in 1973 was primarily to protect MISC, despite the international in its name, on domestic, intra-Malaysian and especially east-west Malaysia routes. Blue Funnel's hope that the Singapore line's failure to turn a profit in its early years would prompt diversification into air services, for example, proved unfounded. Encouraged by Singapore's rubber traders, there was talk of NOL leaving the conference during 1972. But as MJ Said recounted, NOL's managers were cannily aware of the industry dynamics. Liner cargo constituted 25% of the total seaborne trade, but generated 4 times the income of the remaining 75%, explaining why the Singapore line continued its fight for membership with unlimited rights in Singapore. Diversifying beyond the UK-dominated conference system, new building and chartering of oil tankers in partnership with Hong Kong King of the Seas and Onassis of the East, Pao Yue Kong, demonstrated that NOL was not prepared to play second fiddle to the British liner companies. On the other side of the Johor Strait, blue funnel strategists expected MISC to, quote, fiddle conference rules, a bid to force the conference to concede 40% of westbound trade to Malaysian ships. Kuala Lumpur directed MISC to load to capacity between Europe and Malaysia and vice versa in February 1972. In further defiance of the conference, MISC commenced monthly sailings to Bangkok, where MISC was denied calling rights. Meantime, populist economic nationalists Tengku Razali Hamzah, head of the National Corporation and the Malay Chambers of Commerce, demanded nationalisation of the Malacca Strait as restorative justice for Malaysia's shabby treatment at conference hands. In final analysis, an impartial restoration of the imperial factor in decolonisation, it could be argued that British shipping had disengaged from Southeast Asia by the time MISC and NOL were established. Principally with P&O, Blue Funnel entered the Overseas Containers Consortium in 1965, focused initially on Australia and not unpredictable Southeast Asia. In The Making and Unmaking of Malaysia, Tony Stockwell observed that the metropolitan government's priority was to reduce public expenditure, not to promote private enterprise. Dollar earnings from the region were no longer vital by the late 1950s. Viewed from a global perspective, British trade with Southeast Asia was relatively insignificant, and even the oil reserves of Brunei were not particularly valued because they were believed to be in decline, in the early 60s at least. William McNeill of Glenline apprised Raja Mohar in March 1966 that uncertainties clouding the future of trading prospects in the Far East, the political future of Malaysia and Singapore post-split, and similar national lines in other countries in the Far East, all could produce a significant reduction in the proposed Malayan line's earning capacity. By 1972, the possibility of collaborating with the national lines was treated cautiously by Blue Funnel strategists. The Ocean Group was in the throes of being examined by management consultants to advise on reorganisation and diversification. And in nascent realignment, Blue Funnel bid successfully for UK domestic-focused transport group William Corrie. Meanwhile, other British lines were demonstrating considerably less interest long-term in the Far East trade, and they would be participating even less than they are now, according to Blue Funnel. Nevertheless, it was local circumstance that made the running in the making of Malaysia's and Singapore's shipping lines, and which induced imperial reorientation in reaction, not anticipation. If you'll please excuse another set of mixed maritime metaphors, British shipowners were out of their depth in navigating the stormy waters of Southeast Asian business and politics. That was epitomised by the belief shared in Liverpool and Singapore in early 1964 that Lee Kuan Yew would become the next Prime Minister of not independent Singapore, but of Malaysia. Similarly misguided, Sir Douglas Thompson of Ben Line in April 19 dismissed Frank Tsao in April 1965 as not even a proper Singapore Chinese, being a Hong Kong Shanghai type, and surely exactly what the Federation would most dislike. Thompson also doubted if Tsao was really likely to put up money into a shipping venture unless supported by government money, when other ventures yield so much more. How wrong could he be? And Thompson was clearly unaware that Tsao was in the midst of rescuing a textile enterprise in Johor Bahru, bringing together Hong Kong, Japanese and Malayan capital, and through which he developed close relations with Interior Minister Dr. Ismail, who supplied the introduction to Kwok. Tsao was definitely in favour, therefore. The repeated misspelling of Tsao as Tao, or the rendering of Kwok as Kwa in the Blue Funnel records, underlines the shoddy local knowledge in Liverpool, Edinburgh and London boardrooms and despite constant correspondence with agents on the spot. Sir Herbert McDavid confessed in March 1966 that, quote, "I do not feel at the moment that I know enough of the Singapore officials or of the conditions there to make any strong recommendation." Managed economic devolution to match the political transfer of power was the shipowner's ideal. In reality, however, the runaway train of political decolonisation was matched by the runaway steamship of maritime decolonisation. In that, I shall leave the last word with Tony Stockwell on the official mind of decolonisation. When independence came, wait for it, when independence came, ministers and officials were uneasily aware that they had gambled on the future of successor states and the future of British interests in them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was a very convincing explanation of an important aspect of decolonisation, revealing how impoverished really the metropolitan end was, and how they could be so successfully outmanoeuvred on the ground. Did these Asian shippers continue to dock in Liverpool?
Yes. In fact, some of the images, go back, if I can actually give you proof of that. Excuse me. Oh. Yes, so that image there of Bungaraya, which is the first missing ship, that's from 1982. That's would have offloaded palm oil particularly, but so yeah, they were a feature of Liverpool's maritime landscape well into the and certainly to the 1990s at least. The Malay Club, Seamen's Club, probably had family and was revived actually. So yeah, unfortunately, not much trace of that today.
To come back then,
yes, sorry.
We have a moment or two before partying to have sort of questions and comments from the floor. Annabelle.
Thank you very much. Yes, the actual economics of it up beyond my graph. I do want a reaction of how fascinating it was to be in 2000. Malay letters. Very long. Going made boring. And the point in order to get the money, London and outreach program target the places where the fire is and up to acquire this protection, such relevant labor issues. Actually, or we go and reach out and lay community. My Asian journalist, closely Asian community existed in the 2000s. Liverpool was good collaboration. So I knew about the Malay community, what you have back long relationship. Might move on. So you mentioned Tony, but the one I always Tony is your edition of, and you were scratching around for a Mahathir reference.
Yes.
But you only got tangentially, maybe about 2 years ago. From the line onwards, I was putting in touch directly only. So that's your Mahathir reference.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Annabelle. I do remember that exhibition. I remember our discussions about it, and yeah, it's absolutely wonderful. And yeah, I mean, there are still a few descendants. So you occasionally, you know, taxi driver will tell me that they're, you know, the grandson of you know, a Malay seafarer. So that there's still, but not as strong as it would have been in the 70s and the 80s, sadly.
But retained with the students coming to.
Yeah. I mean,
the northwest.
The wonderful book by Tim Bunnell really talks about this transition from the seafarer community of particularly strong in the 50s and the 60s, the golden age, but then moving into this new era of the sort of student population. And you know, have a look at that book, because there's interesting cultural clashes which take place between these two groups sometimes. But yeah, thank you, Annabelle.
You want to come to the microphone, or the
yes,
the people on Zoom will not hear what you're going to say.
Absolutely wonderful. Is it ongoing?
Is it ongoing? Yes, I hope so. Yes, I'm trying to write a book. I've been trying to write a book for a long time about Liverpool and the end of empire, and in which Blue Funnel particularly, and Malaysia features an awful lot. So yes, yes, it is ongoing.
Excellent.
Whether I will ever complete this tome, I don't know.
Feeling, yeah.
But yeah.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yes.
Tremendous.
Well, it's a real pleasure, Tony.
So I think we can now move to be informal, and there are drinks and canapes for those of you who are able to stay a little longer.